To truly understand this entire series of events, we have to go back a little in history, because what is happening today didn't happen overnight. It is the result of cracks that have been forming over decades. In the 1950 seconds, at the peak of the Cold War, the United States and Canada jointly established the Distant Early Warning Line, or DEW line, a chain of radar stations across the Canadian Arctic designed to detect Soviet bombers in time. Technologically, it was a marvel, but politically, it represented a deep infringement on Canadian sovereignty. The stations were funded by the United States, built by the United States, and operated by the United States, with American flags flying over portions of the Canadian North. American personnel were on Canadian soil, operating with minimal oversight from Ottawa. At the time, Canada accepted this because it had no other choice. The Soviet threat was real and existential, and Canada traded a portion of its sovereignty for security. That arrangement became the backbone of US-Canada military relations for the next 70 years. Canada provided the geography, and the United States provided the hardware, technology, and strategic direction. This system functioned for decades because America was seen as relatively stable, predictable, and respectful toward its allies. But in recent years, Canada began to realize that the direction of American leadership was changing. It observed the growing political chaos within the United States, the trade tariffs suddenly imposed on allies, the trend of withdrawing from international agreements, and most importantly, it heard the threats made openly, including the notion of annexing a sovereign nation. For Canadian policymakers, this was a warning that the security framework they had inherited was no longer fully reliable. That is why when Canada decided to strengthen its presence in the Arctic, it made a conscious choice not to repeat the mistakes of the DEW line era. This time, it would not depend on anyone else's systems, it would not accept anyone else's command, and it would not be at the mercy of someone else's political whims. That is why today we see Canada investing in under-ice sensor networks, a domestic drone program, a sovereign satellite constellation, and a national command and control infrastructure. This is not just military modernization, this is a political statement that Canada will be the master of its own security. The consequences of this decision are not just bilateral, they are shaking the entire NATO structure. NATO has always operated on the principle that collective defense sometimes requires sharing parts of national sovereignty under joint command. If a country like Canada can say that its assets deployed in its territory will remain solely under national command, then why couldn't Norway, Denmark, or Turkey do the same? This sets a precedent that could weaken cohesion within the alliance. That is why in Brussels, this issue is being treated not as a Canada-US matter alone, but as a matter with implications for the entire alliance. Russia and China are watching all of this very closely. They are observing cracks appearing in the Western alliance. They are seeing Canada assert independence from Washington, and they are asking the question, who's next? For them, this is an opportunity not to strike immediately, but to wait and let internal divisions within the alliance grow. And then comes the 2026 NATO summit, which is already shaping up to be explosive. For the first time, there is a possibility that the United States could propose something and not have its closest ally support it. This will shake the fundamental assumption in US diplomacy that in the end all countries will follow Washington's lead. But the deeper significance of this entire story is not just military or diplomatic, it is ideological. This is the moment that symbolizes the breaking of American unilateral dominance in the Western Hemisphere. For over a century, under the Monroe Doctrine, the United States has assumed that it is the final authority in the Americas. Canada has now challenged that notion not with words, but with billions of dollars in sovereign military capability. And ironically, it is hard to argue that Canada is wrong to do so. When an ally constantly threatens you, imposes trade wars, and questions your sovereignty, taking out insurance is a rational step. That is the lesson at the heart of this entire event. When you start treating allies as subordinates, when you threaten annexation instead of offering partnership, when you view every relationship through the lens of dominance rather than cooperation, they begin to look for alternatives. Trump wanted to make Canada the 51st state, but in doing so, he inadvertently pushed it to become a far more independent, self-reliant, and strategically aware power. The country that had been considered a quiet neighbor raised its voice. The partner that always followed without question demanded equality. And the superpower that had taken loyalty for granted now has to learn that respect is never permanent, it must be continuously earned. The story doesn't end there. The Arctic continues to warm, the ice continues to melt, and the competition for the top of the world is intensifying. The real question is no longer whether America can maintain control, but whether it is ready to adapt to a changing world and embrace new rules for partnership. The question now isn't just why Canada is taking these steps, but why all of this is happening right now. And at this point, it's impossible to move forward without mentioning Donald Trump. For months, Trump had been openly threatening to acquire Canada, calling it the 51st state of the United States, sometimes jokingly, sometimes as a direct threat, but in international politics, there is no such thing as a harmless joke. He threatened Greenland, suggested using military force to expand U.S. territory. And just this week, following operations in Venezuela, he doubled down on his Arctic ambitions. But here's what Trump and his advisors completely miscalculated. Threats do not work on nations that have options. Canada looked at Trump's unpredictability, the political chaos in Washington, the sudden trade wars imposed on allies under the guise of national security, including the period when US administration labeled Canadian steel a threat and the potential of withdrawing from NATO. They made a cold, calculated decision. The risk of total dependence on America was now greater than the risk of going it alone. And this was not merely a military decision, it was a psychological earthquake. When your closest and most trusted ally concludes that you are too dangerous to rely on, you have lost something irretrievable, then comes the question of why the Arctic suddenly matters so much. This region, long considered remote, frozen, and largely irrelevant, has become the hottest strategic theater on the planet. The answer lies in three words: resources, roots, and power. The Arctic is melting, and as the ice recedes, shipping lanes are opening that are valued in the trillions of dollars. Distances between Asia and Europe are drastically shortened, and beneath the ice lie rare earth minerals, massive oil reserves, and natural gas deposits capable of powering nations for decades. Russia recognized this early. Over the last decade, it has militarized its Arctic coast, refurbished old Soviet-era bases, deployed hypersonic missiles, and now commands the world's largest fleet of nuclear icebreakers, 40 vessels compared to the United States' 2 aging ships. China, thousands of miles away geographically, has declared itself a near-Arctic state, building icebreakers, investing in Arctic research stations, and claiming rights through the Northwest Passage. Meanwhile, the United States assumed Canada would naturally remain an extension of US strategic interests, that Canadian territory and waters would serve as a secure staging ground for American military assets, and that control of the Arctic could be maintained indirectly through Ottawa. Canada has broken that assumption. For decades, the question of who owns the Northwest Passage had been simmering. Canada asserts it as internal waters, part of its sovereign territory, requiring permission to transit, while the United States claims it as an international strait, meaning ships can pass freely without permission. For years, this disagreement was managed through informal understanding. The US would request permission, Canada would grant it, and the legal question was never tested. But climate change changed everything. As the ice melts, these routes remain open longer, and informal agreements are no longer sufficient. Hard power is now necessary. Canada has acted decisively, deploying under-ice surveillance networks, arming its Coast Guard, and transforming it from a search and rescue service into a sovereign naval power, all without relying on American systems. This means that in any crisis, the US cannot simply override Canadian control. This is exactly why Pentagon planners are losing sleep. For 70 years, American nuclear deterrence has relied on one assumption: complete situational awareness. The US must know at all times where every potential threat is. If a Russian nuclear submarine is lurking under the Arctic ice, the US needs to know yesterday. Its entire global military posture depends on that intelligence. But now, Canada is creating a system in which primary Arctic surveillance data goes first to Ottawa. Canada is becoming the gatekeeper of domain awareness. The military will have to request information from Canada to understand what is happening in North American airspace and waters. This is not an alliance of equals nor a traditional